Welcome to this special panel discussion on the complexities of export compliance. Let's meet our panelists for today. We're going to be speaking with Corey Rhodes. He is president of QAD Precision. Hello, Corey.
Hello, Robert. Nice to be here.
Mark Monagle is a senior solution consultant with QAD Precision. Hello, Mark.
Hello, Robert. Thank you for having me.
Jules Cutterba is regional trade lead with AstraZeneca. Hello, Jules.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Adrian Braumiller is founding partner of Braumiller Law Group. Welcome, Adrian.
Thank you so much for having me, Robert.
And Devin Sefton is senior associate with Braumiller Law Group. Hello, Devin.
Thanks for having me.
I want to start this panel by getting from Adrian just a brief summary of what are some of the major changes to export law that we ought to be thinking about right now. Adrian?
Yes, thank you so much. I think really you probably could guess that tensions have continued to rise with China, and so our export control policy is really focused, the changes are really focused on China. First and foremost, there was major changes in the military end-user restrictions on China, Russia, and Venezuela. And certainly we can provide more guidance there, but it basically impacts numerous industries that are previously were not impacted in terms of having to have licenses to these various countries, China, Russia, Venezuela. Specifically to military end users or parties that support the military. So lots of definitions have been broadened. This particular change has swept up a lot of industries and a lot of entities that previously were not part of what we would consider traditionally a military entity. So that's having a huge impact. Then of course we have all of the ever-evolving issues with Huawei and various entities that are related to Huawei. This is because of national security and foreign policy concerns, previously concerned about Huawei's involvement in financial support for sanctioned countries such as Iran. But currently we have numerous entities that continue to be swept up in sanctions on Huawei, requiring licenses to over 100 different entities that are related to Huawei. And then there's also the Xinjiang related measures that involve forced labor concerns and human rights issues, such that this is a province in China, such that several entities have been placed on the entity list requiring a license with a presumption of denial. And then lastly, Hong Kong related measures in which unfortunately Hong Kong has been stripped of its special status and all license exceptions have been removed for exports to Hong Kong. So I think that gives you a very high level overview of what's been going on.
Is that all, Adrian? Really? That's an awful.
That's all.
That's all. That's
Piece of cake.
Awful lot of stuff for companies to think about. Let's drill down to a little bit to China. You brought that up, obviously, with regard to sanctions. I want to ask Devin to give us a quick summary of what we are seeing now in terms of the ongoing trade war, tariffs, and sanctions against Chinese companies.
Yeah, so right now, I mean, we've seen a blurring of the lines in the past few years with trade and sanctions, so it's appropriate to kind of talk about these things together. And we've seen national security, typically things that were relegated to the national security sphere, used as leverage in negotiations with China. And recently, the emergence of kind of put trade talks a little bit on hold or put them in doubt. So it's not really clear what's going to happen with those trade talks. And at the same time, we've seen the Trump administration ramping up, and Congress, ramping up sanction measures against China, including the ones that Adrian just touched upon, the measures against Huawei. Recently, we saw the general license for Huawei transactions expire. We saw the military and use and user restrictions. And we've seen Congress pass a variety of laws that authorize the president to impose sanctions on various companies and persons in China, both in relation to what's happening in Hong Kong and also the Xinjiang region.
Mhm.
So that's basically the status of where things stand, at the intersection of trade and sanctions in China.
There is one more specific thing I'd like to ask you about, Devin, and that is the so-called long reach of OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, an arm of the U.S. Treasury. What does that mean for non-U.S. companies these days?
Well, non-U.S. companies, there's basically 3 or 4 ways that non-U.S. companies get caught up with U.S. sanctions, assuming that they're dealing with something that's pretty much outside of the sphere of what would generally be considered U.S. jurisdiction. The first, you might have secondary sanctions, and we've seen a real expansion of secondary sanctions with respect to China. The recent executive order that was issued by the Trump administration, companies that are engaged in any way sort of facilitate human rights abuses in Hong Kong can be sanctioned under secondary sanctions. Financial institutions could be sanctioned under these secondary sanctions. What that means is they can be cut off from the U.S. financial market or cut off entirely from the U.S. market by being designated as an SDN. The other ways that a non-U.S. company can get caught up with U.S. sanctions if they are owned or controlled by a U.S. person. They, under certain sanction program, can be penalized. They're treated as being subject to U.S. jurisdiction and can be penalized for doing certain transactions. Or if their transaction in any way touches the U.S. Recently, a company was sanctioned or penalized because they engaged in a transaction that required using servers in the US, and therefore, because of that jurisdictional hook, they were able to be penalized under US sanctions. So.
One of the things that exporters have always had to deal with, of course, is that of classification, both inbound and outbound classification compliance. Jules, tell me a little bit about what they need to be thinking about now. Has that been ramped up as well? What are the concerns?
Well, I would say actually, I don't know about ramping up, but classification, I think, is always the most important part of trade. There's 3 most important parts. You gotta get your classification right, your country of origin, and your valuation. So, but you can't get the other 2 without having your classification correct. So especially when you're going through the Chinese tariffs right now, Section 301, and all the different changes when it comes to the free trade agreements, in order to qualify or know if you are affected by any of the Chinese tariffs or the free trade agreements or special trade programs, you have to know your classification. So I always encourage all companies to always do a very thorough look at their classification and really take a hard look at those GRIs, those general rules of interpretation. Also, then reading the chapter notes and explanatory notes, and almost do this yearly, especially right now, anytime it changes. Because one, you could have massive savings. Well, you could also have a massive bill too, but at least you'd be doing it compliantly and not getting into trouble. But with that, so you always want to make sure that your export tariff is matching the receiving side's import tariff as well. And I think a lot of people forget about that and forget about the rules of each country and how they all intersect and connect together. I know a couple of years ago, there was a big push for BEPS, that's the base erosion and profit sharing motive. And it's downgraded a little bit, but how government systems are actually speaking to each other so they know what a company such as AstraZeneca or any other retail company that I've formerly worked for, they know what they're exporting out, and the government knows what the other receiving country is importing in some ways. So now you are looking at government agencies that are getting more tech savvy and sometimes quicker than us companies are getting tech savvy in that space.
Mm-hmm. What we're talking about here right now are the complexities of compliance with just about any type of product being shipped. Of course, it's even more complex and there are even more headaches when it comes specifically to the matter of hazardous goods. Corey, would you talk a little bit about what we need to be thinking about there when it comes to proper classification and compliance?
Yeah, sure. And I think it's really just building on what Jules had just illuminated for everybody with respect to taking into consideration both what your export classification is for the country of export to the country at which you want to import. But I wouldn't even want to say we focus too much on just hazardous materials or hazmat. I think it's really that's part of the problem. This really extends to any what we would consider to be a controlled commodity or substance. And if you think about it again, as Jules mentioned, country of origin being so important, this could potentially for companies, large companies and small companies, you could have multiple sources of origin with almost infinite sources of destination when you look at global shipping, plus what we call the other government agencies or partnering government agencies that will regulate that at a commodity-based level. And these are things that need to be taken into consideration. I've seen, take for example, dietary supplements. This, while not being considered a hazardous material, is something that's heavily regulated by the Food and Drug Administration here in the United States. And if you want to ship those to other countries around the world, they have their equivalent of the FDA, and it's not the same as what we need here in the United States to get that into the country. So, again, I think that's a very key part to managing that piece. I've seen all too many times a lab technician or somebody at a warehouse operator put something in a box, labels it green goo, and ships it to an affiliated company across an international border, and suddenly we have a legal and customs crisis on our hands. Now, while most of us as customs professionals will focus on really the aspects of the legal ramifications of that, there's a lot of operational efficiency and opportunity to be gained in putting in the controls to be able to enable this corporate governance. So what I'm trying to say is you can have your cake and eat it too. And I've got Mark McMonagle, I can tell he's ready to talk here. I want to let him talk a little bit. He's been in the practice for over 30 years and seen a lot of best-in-class companies take advantage of ensuring corporate governance, but at the same time, putting in the operational efficiencies that gets the executives excited to sponsor projects to do, more around putting in controls in this area.
Mark, let's hear your perspective on this.
Sure. I suppose best-in-class companies have invested with the QAD precision to automate the production of their export, shipping, trade, transportation, and hazardous goods documentation. Through to filing export customs declarations electronically with ACE in the United States and with Atlas, for example, in Germany. This allows them to ensure compliance with the governmental regulations for export control and manage their letters of credit better. Without automation, it can be quite a task. However, automating this area in a scalable, repeatable manner, ensuring compliance with the complex demands involved in shipping hazardous materials and crossing borders. In short, the QAD precision solution becomes your centralized global document cookbook, supporting international documentation creation, like pro forma invoices, packing lists, and so on. And it also includes external documentation, certificates of origin, certs, booking forms. Our goal, or should I say, we focus our customers on operational efficiency that is scalable, repeatable, centralized, and automated.
Mark, as long as I have you speaking, I'd like you to address the larger issue too of screening. Why you might think it's important to be screening at the transaction and at the shipment times. Is that something that exporters really need to be keeping in mind? And if so, why?
Sure. So in essence, from a denied party screening, obviously the content changes on a fairly regular basis, potentially on a daily basis. And while some companies may decide to go with an ad hoc approach, just check up front. If they're able to ship the goods out in the same day, that's totally fine. For other customers that have legal departments, they may say, I'd like to run it in a batch mode. So I would like to run our entire customer master database through the compliance check at will. And then of course, some companies like to go with the transactional route. And that could be purchase orders, sales orders, quotes, checking it at shipping stage. So it can vary depending on the business process of the organization.
Yeah. I'm also wondering about the challenges of keeping up with all the various restricted parties and denied persons lists. So is that a challenge, or is that all consolidated? Maybe Adrian, you could speak to that a little bit about how we just keep those lists up to date and make sure that that we have them all at our fingertips and we need to know where we're shipping something.
Well, just as Mark said, I do agree that the software tool is by far the best approach, because again, you can use a consolidated list that the government has, but I always worry about how quickly it's being updated. I'm never quite sure it's as up to date as quickly as it should be. And as we were discussing these entities that have been added throughout all these various developments, with Huawei, there have been a significant number of entities added over the last several months, as well as with military end users and the forced labor issues around Xinjiang. I think I'm saying that right, maybe. So there's about 50 entities that were listed there. So while they're not denied, they are certainly a huge red flag to exporters that they have to go in for a license if they want to ship to those entities. Whereas before they could just ship to those parties, now they've got to make sure they have a license. And in most cases, you should presume denial, and in such a case that it's really like being a denied party. Mm-hmm. So absolutely, that's a critical piece of ensuring compliance because the penalties are so extreme.
As companies prepare for the future, which of course is uncertain by definition, but even more uncertain given what's going on now, I wonder if each of you, if I just kind of like to go around to the panel and ask for each of you as to what is the biggest message you would like to deliver to exporters now in terms of how they can get control, keep control, predict the unpredictable future. What message do you have for exporters right now? Maybe let's start with, let me start with Devin on that.
Well, I mean, if we're talking about, I think that the landscaping is getting so complicated with export controls and sanctions. For global companies, what I'm coming to realize more and more is you really need black and white, clear rules that where more complicated, you can't have something that really accounts for all the rules. So sometimes you have to set a more conservative rule that's just black and white, and then any questions get kicked up the chain. Mm-hmm. So that's something I would recommend for global compliance, global companies that need to establish a compliance program. But other than that, you need a compliance program that stays on top of new developments and is able to flexibly implement those new developments.
Okay, Jules, based on your on-the-ground experience with this, what would be your message to your fellow exporters?
Well, since compliance or export-import trade always seems to be like an offshoot over always to the side, my guess is like get involved with the business decisions, get involved with knowing your product really well, and just always have a seat at the table, especially when things are changing very quickly in a supply chain.
Thanks. Corey, what do you think?
Yeah, I think Jules is spot on with that, but I would add, unless you're NASA, your export becomes somebody else's import. So, you have to think about operational efficiency with your partners and, again, your customers as you're working through doing that. And it's not just, really shoring up and being able to offer operational efficiencies. You can work together to come up with duty management and duty deferral type strategies where you can leverage other solutions that might be available for you and your partners. So I really think that what I would say is don't think of your export as just getting it off your dock or getting it across with a legal control and a check, but think about the entire way to the consumption of that particular product. Because in a lot of cases, like AstraZeneca, there's a person at the end of her supply chain that needs to get that product. So,
sure.
You really have to think of it holistically.
Mark, what's your...
Can I add on that really quick?
Sure, real quickly. We only have a couple more minutes, but you should definitely.
Okay. Well, just because I want to add of that, to Corey's part, that my export is probably someone else's import, yes, and it probably is a related party in some of the companies that you're working for. And you always have to keep that in mind because a lot of times people forget if they're interrelated companies or if they're really external third parties.
Right. So Mark, what is your message to the exporting community when it comes to compliance? Real, just briefly.
At the end of the day, we have to be able to demonstrate due diligence. That means we need to have a system of record or something in-house that is able to record what happened, when it happened, how it happened. And we want to have the KPIs and the dashboards to help our teams to be efficient, to be able to identify the problems and resolve them as fast as possible.
Adrian, how about a final word from you?
Final word is, in a COVID environment, I know a lot of companies are in a cost-cutting mode. Now is not the time to cut costs when it comes to export compliance. Do not cut your people, do not cut your tools or your resources. Now more than ever, you need to invest in keeping abreast of all these changes.
I really want to thank this fantastic panel today for shining the light on export compliance. We talk so much about imports these days that I fear that sometimes this topic gets swept under the rug a little bit. And I think all of you have done such a great job of bringing it to the consciousness of companies and what they need to be thinking about. Corey Rhodes of QAD Precision, Mark McMonigal of QAD Precision, Jules Cutterba of AstraZeneca, Adrian Braumiller of Braumiller Law Group, and Devin Sefton of Braumiller Law Group. Thanks everyone for your participation.